In this tutorial, we will wrap up our three-part series about how to write a comparative essay. We will take a look specifically at writing a conclusion and editing your work for structure. We'll start with the discussion of the conclusion. There's one thing you really need to keep in mind when you write a conclusion is that no matter what style you use in the list I'm about to show you, you must restate your thesis in some way. If you want to think of this as an inversion of your introduction, you certainly can. So just like your introduction concludes with your thesis, your conclusion is going to begin with a restatement of that thesis. And it's a really effective way of reminding the reader what your argument is, and it also signals the end of your paper. So I'm going to quickly go over your options, and I will explain these options to you a little bit more in each slide. You can certainly write a conclusion that moves from the specific to the general and provides a concluding thought. You may attempt to address the challenges of those who might disagree with your argument. You may explain why your thesis matters, or you may attempt to lead the reader to a new question. So those are the four approaches that usually are effective choices. Again, there are a few other options, but these are the four that I think are really key. So let's take a look at how these might work. So let's imagine that we are still working with that introduction and thesis that we looked at in the second video about Forrest Gump and Jerry Maguire. And this section down here of the introduction outlines my thesis. And just to speed up the process, I've come up with a really simple restatement of that thesis to begin my conclusion. And it's not perfect, but it does what we need it to do. So we'll work with the idea that my conclusion is beginning with this sentence: the problematic relationships in Forrest Gump and Jerry Maguire are far from ideal. Okay, so that's what we're going to start the conclusion with. Let's take a look at what our options are and what those options might look like in this context. So if we're looking at the movement from specific to general, and we're attempting to provide a concluding thought, the big advantage of this, I think, is that it's really consistent with the method we use to begin the essay in the first place, right? So it mirrors that general to specific approach we use at the beginning, which is great. The downside to this approach is that it can feel really formulaic. It can feel like you're just walking the reader through steps. And so that's why the concluding comment, I think, is really key. It'll break that feeling of just restating everything that's essentially been already said in the introduction. So if I were using this approach with this restating of the thesis, I would perhaps move in a sentence or two to the fact that we still identify with all these characters in film. And if you look back quickly at the introduction, you can see that it actually begins with that same sort of idea. And I would eventually perhaps try to move the reader to a point where I say something like, don't we seek this kind of emotional connection with any kind of fiction? Now, the next option is to address the challenges. And the big advantage to addressing the challenges, those challenges that those who are against your argument might make, is that it can really provide your essay with a sense of balance, a feeling of balance, because you've acknowledged that the argument isn't necessarily perfect, and that there are certainly other sides to consider. Now, obviously, the potential issue with this is that if you present the challenges in a really strong, effective way, you might actually undermine your thesis and argue against the very thing you're attempting to prove. So as long as we avoid that issue, this approach works really well. So some things I might work with, given my example, is that I might remind the reader that Forrest Gump is deliberately symbolic. Thus, I'm not sure if I should hold the filmmakers accountable for real relationships when real relationships perhaps were not the focus of the film to begin with. In terms of Jerry Maguire, some might argue that this film demonstrates that there are no set rules for how love and relationships need to work, that the two might have Jerry and Dorothy might have a very strained relationship and very business-focused relationship at the beginning, but there is still the possibility that might grow into a real relationship. My third option is that I can attempt to explain why my thesis matters. I guess the definitive so what. So what does my thesis mean for the greater scheme of things. Now, the advantage of this approach is that it allows you to make real-world connections between your argument and the world at large. Now, if this works, this is really effective. The one thing I think you really have to watch for is you have to make sure that the real-world connections you attempt to make are valid. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. If we start with this idea that I have under examples that we need to see positive, healthy relationships in media, I think that's a reasonable kind of real-world connection to make. I could perhaps, in my conclusion, explain that we want to see through media, through film, through television, relationships that are normal, healthy relationships between loving people. Where I can't go with this, if I'm going to keep this valid, is I have to watch out for claims that are simply ridiculous. I think claiming that Hollywood should change its entire approach to the production of film based on my thesis would be obviously a bit of an overstatement. So I need to avoid that sort of heavy-handed feel. Nost Approach is to lead the reader to a new question. The advantage of this approach is that it really leaves the reader with a strong impression because you take them in a direction via this question that they hadn't really anticipated. And if one of the goals of any essay is to encourage the reader to think about the thesis and about the argument long after they're finished reading, then this is a really effective approach. Now, like the last option, we want to make sure that the question is valid and appropriate and is in the proper context. Now, a few examples that might work. Perhaps I could ask a question about Hollywood's responsibilities. Is Hollywood really required to show us healthy relationships? Is this something we should ask or even demand of our filmmakers? Another question I might consider is this one. Is this a reflection of what sells or who we really are? Do the relationships in these two stories just tell us something about what we film companies know we'll buy? Or are the relationships in these films just reflections of our society and how our relationships actually function? So there are your choices. They all will work. I think following the basic steps we've looked at here should get you to where you need to be. Now, there's one more area we want to take a quick look at, and that's editing structure. And I'm going to only present a few ideas here, and I think our focus will be this. Sometimes when you start writing an essay, you think you're on the right track, and you continue writing, and you find out long afterwards that somewhere along the way you lost your mark. You went off track a little bit. So I'm going to show you a few techniques really quickly, very simple steps that you could use to just double check your work to make sure you're on the right track. The first strategy is applicable to the paragraph level. So to ensure that your paragraphs do what you want them to do, try this approach. Reread each paragraph without reading its topic sentence, and then summarize the content. So imagine that the topic sentence isn't there. Read the paragraph quickly in a half sentence, a group of words, just to quickly identify and summarize its content. What's this paragraph about? So once you've done that, you want to take that quick summary and compare it to the topic sentence that begins a paragraph. Hopefully they're quite similar. Hopefully you see clear connections. Now, if you don't, if your summary and the topic sentence don't match, then you need to address that problem, because clearly there's a disconnect between what you think you're proving and what you actually end up proving through your evidence. Another step that can really be helpful, and I like to do this one a lot, is to take your thesis statement, take your topic sentences, and list them in order without all the actual content in the body paragraphs. Now, if you've done your job effectively, what you should see in this list is a flow of ideas moving from the thesis all the way through those topic sentences, and there should be a clear order to those sentences. And if there isn't, if there seems to be a disconnect or steps missing, then you need to address that. Now, the last thing I want you to double check carefully before you submit your essay is I want you to make sure that your sources are integrated effectively into your essay. That means not only should they be fairly frequent, and you can check your rubric for how frequent they should be, but I also want you to make sure that your sources are developed properly. Make sure that you comment on your quotations, your direct quotations, your indirect quotations, to make sure that whatever you're attempting to prove with those sources is actually clearly reflected in what you write in your essay.